A lot of people today, I think, suffer from scrupulosity. Scrupulosity is something that could be looked at from a variety of angles, I think in particular psychologically and also spiritually. I'll say something more about the spiritual way of looking at it. The spiritual way of looking at it, I think, can be described as a disordered concern with one's own righteousness. It's a desire, a disordered desire. And I say it's a disordered desire because I think it fails to understand at least two things. One, our human nature, and two, the gospel. So it's a disordered desire because it is not a correct apprehension of our human nature in at least this sense, where we think that all of our impulses, all of our thoughts, all of the little desires that well up in our heart are themselves moral acts. That everything that passes into my mind or every little impulse I experience in my will must be analyzed morally as a sign of my guilt or of my innocence. There's just so much that happens within our inner life that isn't yet morally to be evaluated. A moral judgment comes into play only when I've exercised my freedom, when I've made a choice. If I happen to think of something for whatever reason, that's not necessarily a moral act. But if I choose to hold on to the thought, to cultivate it, well, now we're talking about something that implicates my will, my freedom, something that I am responsible for. Another way in which I think scrupulosity is a disordered desire or a disorder fails to understand human nature is that it thinks that we can have this autonomous control over our righteousness, where we think that our righteousness is ultimately an effect of our meticulous analysis and our ability to control even the smallest aspects of our interior life, and also, of course, of our actions. There's so much about our interior life and also about our actions that we are dependent upon. Things come into my mind and my freedom is strengthened or weakened by many things outside my control. And I have to humbly accept that in many ways I am not able to deliver all that I want myself to deliver, but I must rely upon others and above all upon the goodness of God to help me achieve the goodness, the righteousness that I so long for. Another way in which scrupulosity misunderstands human nature is that it imagines we could ever know ourselves so thoroughly that if we just sit down and think about it hard enough, we can reach this absolute certainty about our motive, about whether or not our freedom was fully or partially engaged, about whether or not I was really thinking of this thing for that reason. These kinds of judgments are not ones we can make with the kind of certainty that we think we want in order to feel secure, to feel absolutely safe from any counterclaim. We have to, given the nature of our humanity, be ready to make a judgment as best we can and then move on. The second way in which I think scrupulosity analyzed spiritually is a disordered concern for one's own righteousness or some kind of disordered desire, is that it involves a misunderstanding of the gospel. So not just our human nature, but also the gospel itself. And I think the misunderstanding of the gospel is that scrupulosity is, I think, a kind of Pelagianism. Pelagius was an ancient heretic who misunderstood the gospel insofar as he thought that our righteousness is something that we can effect on our own and not something we need to look to the divine physician for help with. That we are fundamentally reliant upon God and His sovereign decision of when and how He sends His grace to heal us. We cannot pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps. We cannot say that we want to be healed now and that we will effect it. We must, as pilgrim people, rely upon God and accept that He is the one who will make the decision about when to purify us. We may think that we've reached a point in our life where we're done with a sin and we want to be over with it. And that's a good thing to be, want to be over with it. And yet it falls to God to decide when and how to heal us. We can't make that decision autonomously. People who suffer from scrupulosity can really suffer a lot. In my own heart, the times I've seen it emerge, but certainly also in pastoral experience, I've met people who suffer truly from it. And my heart goes out to them, and I hope that they know that above all, the Sacred Heart of Jesus Christ goes out to them. He wants them to know Him and His love for them in a way that brings them true peace. Psychologically, it seems to me that at least one of the ways people can suffer from scrupulosity is insofar as it can be classified as a kind of obsessive-compulsive disorder. Because sometimes scrupulous people will experience an inner discomfort, and then they will want to rely upon little rituals that they can perform that in some way soothe the inner discomfort. Sometimes the sacrament of confession can be used that way, where I feel a little icky inside, I feel unsatisfied interiorly, but I know, and if I just go do this little ritual, that I will feel better. Now, obviously, I'm not at all trying to dissuade people in good and holy circumstances from going to confession. But there are times when our motive for going to confession does need to be examined. Am I trying to use God as a little psychological trick to just cure my own interior discomfort? Or am I really going because I've made a judgment that, no, I did do something sinful, and I want now to confess that? Now, I hope I'm not sending anybody who was already scrupulous now into a scrupulous spiral about going to confession or not. What I think you should do, well, certainly, hopefully, by the end of this talk, you'll appreciate this, is have the confidence to make a judgment to the best of your ability, and then leave it aside and trust God. If you know that you've committed a sin, well, then go to confession. But if you're not sure, if you feel guilty, but you really can't say why, there's a good chance there's some kind of emotional discomfort that you might be trying to soothe with this mechanical fix, that it could be a manifestation of an obsessive-compulsive disorder. A good psychologist, a good spiritual director can help you discern that. But at the end of the day, you're going to have to make that judgment in conscience before God. And make it knowing that it doesn't make sense to err on the side of caution. If you say, oh, I get what you're saying, Father, maybe it's an impure motive to want to go to confession, but maybe it's a pure motive to want to go to confession, let me err on the side of going to confession. I wouldn't say that's the case, because if we are going to confession for an impure motive and just trying to treat God like a machine, that is a problem. That's not exactly erring on the side of caution. God wants to be known in truth, not as a psychological trick to make ourselves feel better. Again, don't fall into a scrupulous spiral, but do recognize the importance of making your best judgment and then going forth with it, and getting advice and trusting advice on the matter. Another way in which I've seen people suffer very much from scrupulosity is that it tends to trap them spiritually in a rule-based way of life. They think that their relationship with God is ultimately a relationship with a set of rules, where they're not really looking at the personal God who sees them, knows them better than they know themselves, who understands their circumstances, who has so much power to be generous and to see the ways in which we need to be treated with love if we're to truly grow. God is not an inflexible set of principles who don't even know us by name. People, when they suffer from scrupulosity, they're always trying to please a kind of objective criteria, rules, standards, whatever it might be, things that they have the power to measure themselves against. None of us has the power to measure ourselves against the heart of God. Only God knows what He thinks of us and how He sees us. We best let Him tell us how He sees us. The scrupulous person suffers because they are ultimately putting themselves in the position of measuring themselves, and they're measuring themselves by a set of laws. They're not learning to measure themselves by the tender gaze of the Father. That is the way to see ourselves. That is the way to put ourselves at rest. Think of the story of the prodigal son. The prodigal son initially, and correctly, measured himself against the principles of his filial piety and how he fell short. He had taken the share of his father's inheritance, run off, squandered it, and realized, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. There is some truth in what his judgment reached. But it was not the real full truth, because he should never give a definitive judgment upon himself on his own. His true identity, his true value, is what he will know when he sees himself mirrored in the pupils of his loving Father. And when that prodigal son started to return back home, even while he was still a long way off, the Father saw him, loved him, and ran out to meet him along the way. The Father does not even wait until the Son fixes himself and finally comes back, and then out of generosity welcomes him in the home. The Father sprints out to the Son while he's on the way, while he's still a pilgrim, and embraces him before the Son can even get out his own self-analysis. Remember that. Whenever you're tempted to scrupulosity, whenever you're putting so much stock in your own ability to judge yourself, measure yourself, the father of the prodigal son kind of blows past that self-assessment. He just sees his son walking toward him and embraces him, poor as he is. Gives him his cloak, the ring, slaughters the fatted calf before the son even has a chance to get out his full apology. Thus the Father loves us. Now, there's another point in that parable that I'd like to make. It's while he was still a long way off again. In other words, the son is still on a journey. He's on a path, much like this one. We are all pilgrims on a journey, and it is along the way that the Father loves us. In fact, it is the nature of his mercy to make us righteous by loving us when we are not. It is while we're on a long way off that he loves us, and by that fact, he brings us home. We come home because God loves us before we're there. We must allow him to love us on the way if we're ever truly to come home, if we're ever truly to dwell in the Father's house, to know the intimacy of his love. We must see him flex it while we are so unlovable along the way. Now that means we have to be ready to live like pilgrims. We have to be ready to live within a tension where we know we're not yet home, and yet we still want to be there. There are at least two easy ways of collapsing that tension. One of them is, I think, more the temptation of the scrupulous. That is, to try to find a way to argue oneself into perfection. That is, to not be happy until I can guarantee, certify for myself, no, what I did was right, this was good, I'm not at fault, this is right, and thus to be able to sort of prove for oneself, I'm already home. The other way to collapse the tension is to just give up on home. And that, of course, is also sad. The right way to live, the peaceful way to live, the way to know the love of the Father, is to desire home and to realize you can't get it for yourself. And thus, you're ready to feel his embrace, as while you're still a long way off, you see him near you. If you do suffer from scrupulosity, in a sense, give thanks. All our trials can be turned for the good of those who love God. The letter of James says that trials produce perseverance. They make us perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. Scrupulosity is one trial among many, and it is so within the power of God to take that trial and turn it for our spiritual growth. Look for the opportunity. I would say that the scrupulous person has a tremendous opportunity to discover the true peace of Christ. When Jesus gave peace to his disciples, peace I leave you, my peace I give to you, let us recognize that peace comes to us as a gift. The peace of conscience we strive for is not something we can manufacture by our own powers of meticulous self-analysis. It is something we can only receive as a gift, a word of forgiveness, a word of encouragement that comes to us while we're still a long way off. The scrupulous person knows how exhausting it is to try to find peace in any other way. They, more than so many people, are ready to go to Mass and hear those words, peace I leave you, my peace I give to you, and know the power of that word give. The scrupulous person has an opportunity to enter deeply into the Beatitudes. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. The scrupulous person wants to be righteous, They want to know that they're okay, that they're loved, that they're safe within the hands of God. What a beautiful desire. Hunger for it. But then believe in the beatitude. Believe that God will deliver on his promise. And do not look to feed yourself. Accept to hunger, and you will be satisfied. The scrupulous person has the opportunity, as it were, to take a trust fall into the hands of the Father. The scrupulous person knows what it's like anybody who has done a trust fall, where you stand up and then your friend is behind you, and you experience the thrill of setting aside all self-protecting measures and just casting yourself into the hands of someone you trust. The scrupulous person knows or can know what it's like to do that with God, where they feel the well of anxiety within them, wanting to know they're okay, wanting to take every instrument of self-protection. Then they set it down and just give themselves over to God. How powerful a moment that is. May the scrupulous person find the joy of such a trust fall. The scrupulous person has the joy of being able to see the power of St. Faustina's image of the divine mercy. Jesus, I trust in you. The scrupulous person likely has many stories in their own lives about ways they've tried to trust in themselves, ways in which they've tried to argue themselves into their own righteousness. Now they're ready to say, I no longer trust myself. I no longer trust my ability to stay without sin. I no longer trust my ability to meticulously analyze my interior life and make decisions about what is or is not a sin, or how can I or can I not control this or that. I just give myself to you, Jesus. I trust you. I'm tired and I know I'm unable to analyze myself so thoroughly. I just give it to you. Please make me righteous. I trust you with my life. I'm ready to embrace, or I want to be ready to embrace, whatever trials you send me along this pilgrim life, whatever is necessary to help me grow in the measure and at the speed that you desire. If you let me linger on this pilgrim path so thoroughly unimpressive to myself, I trust you with that. I know that before the final day, you will make me pure in your time. I trust you, Jesus. That's a powerful prayer the scrupulous person has the opportunity to make, and to make with an awareness of all the stakes that are involved, how much we want to secure our own righteousness, to be pleased with ourselves, and how beautiful it is to just give all that to Jesus, to trust him truly with everything. If you or someone you know struggles with scrupulosity, I highly recommend a wonderful book by Kevin Vost, who has a doctorate in psychology. The title is Scrupulosity: Heal Your Mind, Unbind Your Soul, and Let God Work. It's published by Our Sunday Visitor in 2023, and I'll put a link to it in the show notes. Kevin Vost is, in my view, representative of what I find so beautiful about Vatican II. That is, on the one hand, Kevin Vost is drinking so deeply from the faith of the Church. He is holding on intensely to the deposit of faith. He's swimming in Scripture and tradition, in the liturgy, in the witness of the saints. He's quoting the teaching documents of the Church. And he's also very aware of the secular world. He's a doctorate in psychology, and he is very, very well versed in all of the literature that belongs to that discipline. And so he's able to take the ancient faith, ever living, and bring it into dialogue with whatever wisdom we can know from another discipline. And he presents this in such an attractive and pastorally sensitive way. Kevin Vost shows that to be intellectual, to be really smart, to have read a lot of books, is not necessarily to be removed from pastoral concern. The faith does not need to be dumbed down in order to become accessible to the faithful. The faith can be brought in its full power to engage the concrete lives of the people if you have an author, I believe, like Kevin Vost. Give his books a shot, particularly this one, if you suffer from scrupulosity, and I think you'll enjoy it. My prayers for everyone in the Church, for everyone in the world, and in particular way for everyone who suffers from scrupulosity. May we all come to trust Jesus ever more deeply, and through him come to an ever greater apprehension of the face of the Father, who looks upon us with such tenderness, and cast ourselves into his arms.